Friends, would you bow with me in prayer? Almighty God, let now the words of my mouth and the meditations of each one of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock, our strength, and our Redeemer. Amen. It's late at night. It's pitch black, and your bladder tells you that you're not going to make it until the morning. You're in an unfamiliar place. The curtains are drawn. There is not even a drop of moonlight to help you find your way to the bathroom. You gingerly step out of bed and reach your hands out tentatively in front of you. Nothing. You step forward and you grope in the dark, hoping to make contact with a wall or a counter, or better yet, a doorknob. It won't do to have you waving your hands wildly around. You might knock over a lamp or bash your knuckles against the wall. So you grope, not knowing where out there is something that you'll latch onto. You reach slowly and carefully because you don't know exactly what it is you're going to encounter. You step forward and ouch! You hit your little toe on the bed frame, or maybe it was the corner of the dresser. It doesn't matter. It just reminds you that you need to search gingerly. And then, there, just to the right, it's the wall. Something to hold on to, something to follow. You run your hand along that strong, solid, comforting wall until you find the door frame. And you reach inside, groping with your hand, knowing that it's there, and then, yes, the light switch. You've had moments like those in your lives, haven't you? We've all groped in the dark, facing the unknown, hoping to find what we are looking for. In the book of Acts, Paul goes many different places teaching about Jesus and his resurrection, and in some of those places, he is well received. But more often than not, Paul is run out of town or thrown in jail. In our lesson for today, Paul is in Athens. He's taken to the Areopagus, a meeting place in Athens, where people exchange ideas, where people are sometimes grilled on what they believe. It is not entirely clear whether this is a trial or if it's simply a forum for communication. But one thing is clear. The Athenians knew that there was this foreigner in town, and they were quick to bring him in to find out what he was teaching. Paul is perceptive. He knows that Athens is the center of Greek thought and philosophy. He knows that he's talking to the intelligentsia, who are deeply religious in one way or another. But he also knows that they are groping in the dark. Paul is thoughtful. He doesn't outright reject the Athenians and condemn them for worshiping other gods. He observes. He listens. He's curious. He pays attention to where these people are, and he meets them there. He hopes for an opening to be able to tell them about Jesus, and he finds one. They have built shrines all over their city to all sorts of gods. And just in case they've missed one, they've built in a fail-safe altar to, quote, an unknown God, unquote. And this is Paul's in. He sees that these folks are truly interested in the meaning of life and in understanding the world in relation to the holy. Too often churches these days do not engage in dialogue with those who are spiritually different from themselves. Too often churches simply condemn that which they do not understand. William Willimon suggests, quote, the church, rather than standing back from pagan religiosity and pointing fingers in righteous indignation, should, like Paul in Athens, minister to their searching, unquote. When I was on sabbatical in my first pastorate, Jay and I went to Guatemala with an organization called Witness for Peace. We were there to be a white Western presence in towns where the military would come in regularly and kill the peasants. If there were Americans who potentially could be caught in the crossfire or who could observe the violence, then the military would choose not to enter into that town and not to bring violence and death to the peasants. Just our presence protected people. We visited a number of communities on that trip, and we heard stories about people who had lost loved ones, people who had been disappeared. One of the villages that we visited had a Catholic church right in the center of the square. Many of the churches had statues of saints on the walls, and these saint statues were carved and painted beautifully, but the Guatemalan people, they dressed their saints with intricately embroidered fabrics as well, making the saints look a little bit more like them and honoring them with their best gifts. When we walked into the church in the center of town, we saw a statuette of Jesus riding a donkey, and tied lovingly around the donkey's neck and draped over Jesus' arm were ears of corn. The Mayan people had worshipped Hunahpu, the maize god, the god of corn, who was depicted as a young man responsible for the life cycle, the planting and the growing and the harvesting and the replanting of maize, the main crop in Guatemala. When Christianity was introduced and adopted by the Guatemalan peasants, they saw Jesus, the young man who was killed and rose from the dead, as the one who embodied the life cycle. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection made sense to these people who had tried to connect with the Holy One by worshiping Hunahpu, the god of the corn. Paul was also making this kind of a connection with the Athenians. That's what he was really hoping to do. He wanted them to see Jesus so that they would find the answers to their questions. The unknown God that they searched for had been made known in this world in the person of Jesus, and Paul had come to teach them about Jesus. Marcus Borg suggests that our God is all-encompassing. Instead of rejecting people's faith and throwing out anything that is not what we brought with us, perhaps we should, as Christians, remember that our God is expansive. Borg writes, quote, "This concept imagines God as the encompassing spirit to whom everything that is. The universe is not separate from God, but in God," unquote. Paul puts it this way: "For in him we live and move and have our being," unquote. Theologian Paul Tillich made famous the idea that God is the ground of being. God encompasses and yet is beyond existence. God is the power of being itself. God is the source of all things. When we grope for God, we are reaching out to that which is already surrounding us and filling us. God is there. We just need to reach out and find and connect with the Holy One. Reverend John Boyle describes his most powerful memory of searching. He tells this true story, which is, quote, "A frightening experience I had as a young man in a foreign land facing possible death. It occurred during World War II in France, not far from the border with Germany, on an extremely cold and pitch black night in early March 1944. I was a combat infantryman, and our unit was dug into the side of the hill of a wooded hill. The enemy had infiltrated our lines and bayoneted rather than shot some of our people on guard duty so as not to be detected as easily. Consequently, the order came down for us to evacuate the area and to move to a new position several hundred yards away from the hill that we were on. We were to secure our gear so as to eliminate noise and to move out in single file down the hill over very uneven terrain. Since it was so dark, in order to keep together, we were instructed to hang on to the ammunition belt of the person in front of us, while the one behind us hung on to ours. We moved silently, not uttering a sound, like a line of circus elephants walking single file, hanging on to one another. We had only gone a few yards when suddenly I stepped in a depression in the ground and lost my footing, and though I did not fall, I did lose my grip on the man in front of me and caused the man behind me to lose his grip. In panic, I realized that I was cut off from those around me. I dared not cry out for fear of giving us away to any enemy nearby. Frantically, in the tomb-like darkness that enshrouded me, I groped in vain to find the man I had been hanging on to, fearful that others would have gone and left me. Suddenly, a hand grasped my shoulder tight, and another was clasped around my mouth to keep me from crying out. I was sure it was the enemy, and that I would soon feel the cold steel of the sharpness of a bayonet that would put an end to my life. Then the whispered voice in my ear let me know that I had been grasped by the man who had been behind me, who had lost his hold on me. He too had been groping, reaching out, seeking once more to connect with me, and he had found me. Hanging on to each other, we soon caught up to the column of men ahead of us and reconnected with them, unquote. We all know what it's like to be in that moment of disconnect, when we feel alone and without direction. In those moments, we are groping for God, reaching out, needing, hoping, praying to connect with the ground of our being. The gospel lesson puts it in this way, quote, "In a little while the world will no longer see me, but you will see me. Because I live in you, you will also live. On that day you will know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I in you," unquote. To the Athenians, Paul speaks about God as that connective link. It is God who ties all of these things together. God in Jesus embodies all of those other gods. There is no longer need for any shrines or pantheons of God, those that they've worked so hard to build altars to, because the one who was formerly unknown to them, our God, is an all-encompassing God. God is the ground of all being. God is the one who holds us and who holds the world together. When we grope for God, we're searching for a part of ourselves that already exists. We're trying to find that piece within us that seems to be missing. There is, in each of us, a God-shaped hole that only God can fill. When we grope for God, when we ask deep theological questions, when we reach out for support in times of crisis, when we feel ourselves falling and reaching out to grab a hand, it is the hand of God who comes to us. It might be in the form of a friend or a stranger who catches us, or it may be a feeling of the presence of the Holy One that we cannot explain. As we spend time in social isolation, most of us have far more time for contemplation and for prayer. We have time to rage at God about this virus and the ravages that it has brought to our lives, and also to lift up to God the irresponsible and dangerous behavior of others that can bring such devastation. Groping for God can be an act of frustration or anger, but it can also be an act of intentionality and thankfulness and awe. During this stay-at-home time, we're invited to take time to contemplate the joys of slowing down. We can appreciate the daily growth of the leaves, and then the bud, and then the petals of a tulip. We can search for and find God as we watch a pair of bluebirds in flight. We can walk with God through the woods, marveling at the mosses and the budding bushes and the trees. We can even grope for God in our dreams, allowing our subconscious selves permission to reach out in darkness as we hope to connect with the Holy One. This is a time to discover the presence of God in the vastness of the multiverse and to be amazed that God is everywhere in all things. And also to feel profoundly that God is so close to us that we are enfolded and hugged and embraced by the one for whom we grope, the one who brings us grace and hope. God is as far away as you can possibly imagine and as close as our heartbeat as we grope for God. Let us not just search for answers, but let us allow ourselves the freedom to encounter the ground of being with no expectations at all. God is waiting. God is here. Let your souls reach out to connect with the God in whom we live and move and have our being. Alleluia. Amen.